Hi everyone, my name is Elena Popchock and I'm the exhibition developer here at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. You're joining me here today in our newest exhibit, the 19th Amendment, How Women Won the Vote. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights for women. Now we start the exhibit in 1848, which was the Seneca Falls Convention. And we go all the way to 1920 with the ratification of the amendment, and also beyond to tell the story of how the fight continued for some. Now, there are three main goals that we set out to achieve in this exhibit. We wanted to capture how over the course of 70 years, how voting rights expanded for certain groups of people, leading to that amendment. We also wanted to share the stories of the generations of diverse women and men who fought for women's suffrage. And lastly, that 1920 date, we wanted to make sure people understood that the fight continued, particularly for women of color who were prevented from going to the ballot box and subjected to poll taxes and literacy tests. So their fight had to continue beyond 1920 and all the way through 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And ultimately, then they were able to vote for the first time. Now you might be wondering, I've used the term suffrage. That means voting rights. And there's also another term used, suffragist. And that's the American term, denoting people who were fighting for the right to vote. And there's also the term suffragette, which you may have heard. And that actually comes from the British movement. And actually in America, that was a derogatory term at the time. Now, as we start in 1848, we pick up the story with the Seneca Falls Convention. We share with you the stories from that first formal women's rights convention. It's important to remember what life was like for women at that time. In particular, we focus on the rights of married women, because this is what they were focusing on. Because as soon as women entered marriage, there were certain rights that they no longer would have, including the right to inherit property, to own their own wages, and to have rights to their children. When you envision what that life was like, you can see why Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton decided to organize a gathering in upstate New York for women to discuss these issues and figure out how best to pursue rights such as the right to sue or be sued, or the right to speak in public. And one of the demands that Elizabeth Cady Stanton pushed for was the right of women's suffrage. And ultimately, it was included in the final resolutions that were passed at the convention. But it was only one demand among many that the convention pursued. And while we feature a copy of the Declaration of Sentiments, it was really exciting to pull out some of the grievances that they included in their declaration. See, Elizabeth Cady Stanton modeled it after the Declaration of Independence. And featured here are 16 grievances against men. So the little change there, it wasn't grievances against the king, actually against men. And bemoaning the fact that women were denied the right to the elective franchise, that they were denied access to a higher education, and kept out of certain occupations. So while we are in an exhibit focused on women's suffrage, it's important to remember just all the things that they were fighting for. And while we do focus on Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott in this first section, we continue the story by bringing together all the diverse women and some men who fought for women's suffrage. There were 3 generations of these people who were fighting for women's suffrage, and we are excited to share their stories. In 1870, the country ratified the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights for African American men. This had important ramifications on the women's suffrage movement, as people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton refused to support the amendment. They believed that white, educated women should have the right to vote before black men. There were other women who continued their fight, believing that the 15th Amendment was progress towards the ultimate goal of universal suffrage. So there's an important split in the women's suffrage movement. And on the camp that supported the 15th Amendment are people like Frederick Douglass, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Lucy Stone. Now we feature Lucy Stone here in part to show the generational fight that continued through this movement. So in her picture is her daughter, Alice, who later would become a suffragist and continue the fight that her mother and father started. So it's really amazing when you start to look at these portraits, you read these stories, and you see how generations of diverse women continued that fight over the course of 70 years and beyond. Now we also feature the story of Sojourner Truth. And she was formerly enslaved in New York, and she was a big supporter of the women's suffrage movement and attended and spoke at some of the annual conventions in the 1850s. Now by the Reconstruction era, plenty of women, like Sojourner Truth, realized they should go to the ballot box and try to vote. After all, the 14th Amendment said that you're a citizen, so therefore, they figured that means we have voting rights. This was known as the New Departure tactic. And as women attempted to go to the ballot box, they had different experiences. Sojourner Truth, she went in Battle Creek, Michigan, and she was turned away at the polls. But other women like Susan B. Anthony was ultimately arrested and tried for illegally voting. But by this point, during Reconstruction, some women actually could vote. Wyoming Territory in 1869 was the first in the country to grant women full suffrage, and other states were soon to follow. And that state campaign was a huge part of the suffrage movement that continued into the 1900s and played a big role in getting women a national amendment that secured their voting rights.